All right. So a brief intro and recap from last time. Hey boys, we have to be completely quiet during this class, okay? Can you do that? All right. So just at the beginning, just want to reaffirm and point out the idea of this class is not to further a certain agenda, whether that's like pro-psychology or anti-psychology, or to advance some kind of thing like that. There's not the idea of like building up a case for or against. It's rather just trying to put psychology, like modern clinical psychology, and the Orthodox spiritual tradition sort of side by side, and seeing sort of what they have to say to each other, and then using that to sort of say, how can somebody who is a committed Orthodox Christian most positively use psychology? So with that said, I know we're like talking about a lot of sort of sensitive things that impact people's lives really deeply, and things that can be touchy. So I just kind of want to say from the outset, I will try not to make any implications. I'm not going to sort of insert something or hint something. If I'm saying something that I think we can really glean from looking at these two side by side, I'll say it explicitly, just so no one gets any wrong ideas about things. So the recap from last time, we talked about faith and reason and how they fit together. And I said that rationality is good. It's part of the created nature. It's something that God made. It's a faculty that we all have. And so it's certainly not evil, and it can actually assist faith. And the fathers talk about ways that we can use our rational mind and our logical mind to assist faith. Both of the parts of us, like that kind of rational side and that spiritual side, are both part of who we are as human beings. And the fathers also say that reason really finds its home in faith. Like that's where reason does the most good, is when it's working in that life of faith. Some of the saints also talk about the limits of reason, and they say that while reason finds its home in faith and is good in faith, if it seems to be pointing to something outside of faith, then it's just that. It just seems to be pointing to outside of it. And the image that I think is appropriate here is that imagine like a beginning painter who's taking lessons from a master who's been painting for 50 years and is an acknowledged expert, right? When the master painter tells the beginning painter, some kind of technique or whatever, the beginning painter might want to critique, like, that's not necessary to do it like that. You could do it a different way. So it seems very rational to that person in that moment, but they actually don't know. Or there's much more to it. So there's that sense that rationality can seem to point away from faith, but we're always encouraged to kind of keep that in its place and not let it undermine faith. So while science and psychology being an aspect of science is not unspiritual or bad for Orthodox Christians to engage in, it's good and natural. The caution is just to not let it undermine faith. So we also said that mental health and all health issues are not really part of God's idea for creation. We weren't supposed to struggle with these things, both mental health issues and physical health issues. These are the result of the fall. Right? Adam and Eve did not suffer with anxiety issues, etc. So while psychology and orthodoxy both pursue healing, and they do it by drawing on and observing our behavior and our thoughts. So I think a helpful distinction to make at this point is that there is mental health, and then there's clinical psychology, like the field proper, right? And mental health being a much broader thing that you can approach through science, you can approach through just experience, and everybody interacts with this, right? And the spiritual tradition speaks to this. If you read the book of Proverbs, it's full of a bunch of observations of, if you do this, this will be the result. If you train up a child, then he'll continue in that way. That's a mental health observation to make. It's saying, this is how humans work. If you do this, if you have this experience, this will result. There's nothing different in that, in principle, from the field of clinical psychology, except that clinical psychology uses science and evidence-based practices to sort of completely harness that and prove it and identify exactly which practices are the most beneficial from that perspective. So really, while you could say there's, talk about Orthodox spiritual life encompasses not just our overtly religious practices like praying and et cetera, but also mental health, in that spiritual life is geared toward seeing how humans act, aiming toward our healing, this experience of the saints of learning what leads to the healing of the soul. So they're not really opposed to each other in that way. They both seek to help us to function as best as we can. We talked about how healing in healthcare, we made that distinction between kind of the physical and the emotional and also the spiritual. We talked about the nous a little bit, and how healing in healthcare, whether that's physical health or mental health, really works on those planes, like the sort of physical plane, like healing our body from some kind of disease, or healing our brain or some sort of thought pattern that we have. It doesn't so much touch that noetic plane, the plane of the nous and the spiritual. It does, let me amend that, it does touch it, it does affect it, but it doesn't have as its goal the healing of that spiritual plane. It kind of sets out to heal the mental, the physical. So I said last time that the nous, our kind of spiritual center, the part of us that is capable of religious experience, it is involved in everything, it touches everything. So our physical and our emotional is related to our spiritual intimately. But while that's the case, they are still kind of separate in a sense. And I think it's fair to say the consensus of the church is that the emotional plane and the physical plane can provide sort of bad soil or like non-starters for spiritual life, but can't exactly sink it all by themselves. Some qualification is necessary with that, but I'll go into that in just a little bit. So main point there is that we can acknowledge they touch each other and that they relate to each other, but we should not completely equivocate them and not say mental health is spiritual health. Therefore, like, so if I am healed mentally, if my thoughts are healed according to the way psychology would describe it, that I have obtained spiritual healing. You've got to keep that separation there just a little bit. So orthodoxy doesn't just seek to kind of heal us on this physical or emotional plane, but on the deepest parts of our being, the deepest self. But because mental health issues and even physical health issues are very deeply rooted in our spiritual issues and who we are at the core of our being, a lot of times you'll see that spiritual health, if you obtain spiritual health, mental health and even physical health can sometimes follow from that. So that said, psychology can offer assistance to that process. We'll detail that a little bit as we go. But I would say that's especially the case in cases of debilitating mental illness. So I said just a little bit ago that psychological issues can be sort of a non-starter or like bad soil for spiritual life. I think the place where we see that's the most true is in very, very serious mental health issues. Like, so you can imagine if somebody has such bad anxiety that they can't leave their house to get to church, how are they going to have an Orthodox spiritual life if they're so terrified that they can't even leave their house? And same deal, if somebody is so completely depressed that they are suicidal, can't get out of bed, can't take care of themselves, how are they going to pick up their prayer rope and go to their prayer corner, right? So there's this way in which these really serious mental health issues can make it like almost impossible to start an Orthodox spiritual life. So that's one of the ways that I would say the Orthodox way of looking at it has to praise the mental health side. And it's like the mental health, especially clinical psychology and psychiatry, can be of great use in just alleviating a lot of these really, really serious issues that can then allow somebody to continue into spiritual life and have, I guess, more of a chance to actually struggle with it. Let's see. Yes, so what I said before, the idea is, the agenda is truth, right? The idea is to put these two next to each other. We talked about how, because orthodoxy, whatever we believe about eternal things, whatever we hold as like our core values of what is the meaning of life, anytime we have a belief like that, that's going to have to direct everything else that we see. So orthodoxy being that thing, that kind of primary thing, and mental health being like a tool that we can use. The idea is to look at those deeply, not just with like the kind of surface level exploration like everybody has seen before, but to actually like really get into kind of the hard answers of how do these impact each other in a real way. And sometimes, I think inevitably, whenever you have two different kind of worlds coming together adjacent like that, you're going to have some tension. One will kind of like push against the other, and the other one will push back in different ways. And I think it's an important principle at the outset to acknowledge there will be this tension, but if we see one pushing on the other, it can be a temptation to sort of like overreact against that and say, well, orthodoxy is casting perhaps some doubt on this aspect of psychological health, and then go too far with that and say, like, well, orthodoxy is saying that's bad. I think that's probably too extreme, and maybe the best approach, I think, when we see these points of tension where they're kind of pushing on each other, is really just to acknowledge it and say, like, so that's a point of tension, and just be aware of that. The idea is not so much to be neurotic about like what will orthodoxy allow me to do with psychology, but kind of like look at the boundaries, right? So there are some things we can't say. We can't say that God can't heal me. We can't say that like the church is inadequate or doesn't have what it takes for our healing. But on the other hand, we also can't say that God only heals through like overtly religious means. We have to affirm that like God gave us the rest of the world and science and technology, and that could be God's way of healing for us. So just sort of keeping an eye on like these boundaries, and how we actually implement that is a more detailed question that's kind of up to us in our individual circumstances, but just to lay that out. I wanted to clarify, last week I realized I was a victim, and then I made you all a victim of a poor speech to text. I was copying down a quote from St. Isaac, and I just hit the microphone thing, and I saw that that's not always completely accurate. So I'll restate that quote, and then, because that explains what I'm talking about right now pretty well. So St. Isaac the Syrian, he says, when grace is abundant in man, like when we have this overflow of grace, like kind of think like a saint who is just full of grace, like someone like St. Paisios. He says, he easily scorns the fear of death. That's the word he uses, but you could just as easily replace that with pain, sufferings. It doesn't bother him at all, right? Just like when you hear stories of the martyrs who are happy to go to death, right? They're not worried about it. They're not like full of fear and anxiety. They are just okay with it. Saying as it goes on, because he longs for righteousness and finds in his soul many reasons why suffering tribulation is necessary for the sake of the fear of God. So this is one of those kind of boundaries. We can kind of see that it's in the tradition that like when filled with grace, when we live the spiritual life par excellence to the nth degree, we have all these examples of how that sort of allows us to sort of transcend even some of these physical and mental limitations. Stories of, basically where you can kind of, saints can kind of like step outside of their psychological schemata, these things that would normally be limiting things, they're kind of human cares and anxieties. There's this idea that with enough grace, with enough spiritual health, that isn't really a factor for these saints anymore, right? Even in their life. And you can kind of note, like when you read saints and what they have to say, they aren't really like complaining so much about mental health problems. You don't see saints being extremely insecure or not being able to kind of function on a day-to-day basis. just as a general practice. But we also have to point out on the other side, to make a boundary on the other side, that that is not what you could say is normal. It's an extraordinary amount of grace. But we have to kind of keep that fact in mind because it does point to the ultimate relationship between like the spiritual and the physical. Is everyone on board with this ish so far? Okay. I want to make sure I'm making sense. Let's see. Yeah, so spiritual life, like I said, it does include these mental health aspects, not like, clinical secular psychology in the scientific field, but it does have these mental health aspects. If you read like the Ladder, for instance, he talks for a good bit about depression and anxiety and worries and cares. Not in the same way that a clinical psychologist would nowadays, but the Orthodox have always been concerned about like our mental health because it's part of how we live our lives. So they're not brushing our feelings, our emotions, our experience aside and just saying like, just pray it away. Like, aren't you a good Christian? Just fast a little bit and it'll be fine. You don't really see that. They engage these things. They acknowledge their reality. So we can that like technically there is healing to our mental health issues through the spiritual life because it includes the mental health, like I said. But we have to keep in mind the question isn't what's technically true or what's technically possible. The question is what is best. And an image of this, I guess, is that you could technically ride a 16-speed bike with only the 16th speed and start on the highest gear, right? But like you can do that. The bike will move if you push hard enough on the pedals. It will work, but that's also dumb, right? There's other gears. There's ways to make this better. It's just like the same idea of like if you're trying to swing on a swing, like you can start at a dead stop and just by moving your legs back and forward enough with time you can get moving, but you could just also have somebody push you or you could just start by swing. So like we don't need to be dumb. We don't need to say, well, just because I could theoretically be healed without clinical psychology or psychiatry, therefore I should. This saint did it, so therefore I can do it. Or have any kind of shame in ourselves for doing it. There's nothing to be ashamed about if what you're doing is doing the best thing for you and doing the best thing for your health and for your spiritual life. So I guess to be very clear then, I'm not saying, and I believe the church wouldn't say, that ordinary people in the world should not use mental health services or have this idea that if we were just good enough Christians, if we just prayed a little harder, if you just believed a little more, that is not Orthodox. I would say that the church understands the human heart and the human soul and the human life, and so there's no room for shaming ourselves in spiritual life and getting ourselves despondent, full of despair, saying, look, I guess it's just hopeless for me because I try to pray, but the depression doesn't go away. That's not what we're called to. That's not how the fathers guide us. Right? Our job is to do the best we can with the hand that we've been dealt. The only tension that the spiritual life would push on that a little bit is that you can see in the tradition there is this understanding that suffering isn't necessarily bad, that suffering can be a good thing for us. And this you'll see saints talk about this in terms of not getting professional treatment for physical health conditions or for mental health conditions. I was just reading St. Paisios the other day, and he was talking about not going to a doctor and dealing with the pain that he was going through. The idea being that state of pain that he's in would draw him to pray to Christ that much harder and to throw himself at Christ and say, like, in my pain, Lord, have mercy, from this like truly desperate place. That's true, and that's in the tradition. But at the same time, that only works if your response to that pain and suffering is actually to draw closer to Christ. If you are going through that pain and suffering and you're just miserable and you're resentful and you're saying, I deserve this pain because God hates me because I did, something like I stole a pencil when I was 5 or something like that. If you're taking that pain and suffering and using it to put yourself in a place of despair or despondency, that's not it, right? It's only good if it does what it's supposed to do. So therefore, it's not just for everybody. Again, we can't take what the saints do and just say, I should do it. The saints fasted for 40 days, therefore I should fast for 40 days. But then again, the tension, the other side, is that we're talking about how Orthodox spiritual life is capable of healing our mental health issues, and that does require significant effort on our part. If it's not just an automatic thing where you just can drift through like spiritual life and then find deep spiritual or mental healing through that. I like to kind of think of the principle of weightlifting. I used to lift weights a lot, and in weightlifting, you have so much weight that you can push up. So let's say you can bench press 225 pounds 10 times. It would be dumb, and every weightlifter knows, that you don't just say, okay, well, I want to get stronger, so now I'm going to put 315 pounds on the bar, because you're going to hurt yourself and get trapped under the bar and look stupid. That doesn't work. You won't get stronger doing that. You'll get hurt. And it's the same thing with spiritual life. We have to keep adding weight onto the bar. It should never be comfortable. We should always be pushing ourselves, because it's in that struggle that we find healing from our issues and that we get stronger. But you have to be really careful not to just throw a whole bunch of weight on the bar and wreck yourself. And this is why the Orthodox Church, thank God, has this concept of the spiritual father. We have a hard time deciding this stuff for ourselves and saying I should be able to do more spiritually, so I'm going to start praying for an hour every morning, an hour every night. That's going to lead to problems. So we have spiritual fathers who can say, no, why don't you just do 10 minutes in the morning at night and see how that works. Because that doesn't do anybody any good to fail or to get hurt or to have shame in ourselves and say, I should be able to fast for 40 days. I should be able to not get medical treatment. There's no virtue in not getting medical treatment unless you are in that rare case of wanting to undergo this serious struggle, right? So again, that's one of those things. It's something to hold in tension and to be careful about. The idea is not to see these things in the saints and the fathers like their great asceticism, their fasting, their enduring suffering, even if purposely not relieving themselves of suffering. We don't want to look at that and say, well, that's just crazy. That's only for saints on Mount Athos, because that's not exactly the case. We can participate in that and stuff to a certain degree, but we also don't want to do the opposite thing and say, St. Paisios did it, therefore I'm going to do it. Ask your spiritual father. Anyway, so I would say in general, the basic question then of how should we use mental health services is there something in your mental health which is keeping you from doing things which you could otherwise do? And if the answer to that is yes, then the field of psychology is evidence-based, it works, and it can help you to get to those goals. So because of that, it's advisable. It can help you in your mental health, which can then also help you in your spiritual health. The question isn't, can you just handle the pain? We're not theological minimalists where it's what do I need? I want to use the least amount of resources possible to be a good Christian. Right? We don't believe in sola scriptura. We accept tradition. We accept the saints. Same thing with this. We're not just saying I don't, strictly speaking, need mental health, so therefore I won't use it. I would say that's not an Orthodox spirit. And I would say that Orthodox summary of how to use mental health, and we'll go into it a little bit more today, is basically to think of it as a tool. So use it as a tool, like a hammer that you can pick up. If you have a nail that needs to get nailed into the wall, you grab a hammer and you hit it into the wall, right? But you don't use that hammer to hit yourself in the face, right? Use the tool properly to do a job that will help you in your life. So that was a kind of a long recap of what we talked about last time and the time before that. But today, my idea is to go into more like specific examples, practicalities, and then also some various hot takes, I guess, or like things that people might wonder about, controversial questions, right? Like, what about demons and mental health, bro? Like that kind of thing. So talking about tension a little bit, I wanted to bring this up, and I said at the beginning that my goal is to be true to both of these traditions, to psychology and also orthodoxy. So one of the things is that if you go online and look up Orthodox saints on psychology, you might not find Orthodox saints saying, go to psychology, it's great, you know, like healthy minds, healthy souls, let's all be happy and affirm ourselves. They don't really talk like that. And this is part of the reason why I want to give this sort of in-depth view of how the Orthodox think about it. Because if what you're taking in is sort of a simple message of like, well, Orthodox Christians can just use psychology and it's all great. You might go online and see saints talking about it and be like, whoa, like was I lied to by these people seeming to completely affirm psychology in every way? So I'm trying to give sort of a more in-depth picture so that we won't be scandalized. So I'm trying to give like the real, full, deep Orthodox tradition on it. So speaking of that tension, in particular, when I looked this up, when I Googled this a few weeks ago, one of the main articles that popped up is there's an article of Saint Sophrony talking about psychology. I think his icon is right there. Yeah, very recent saint. He's awesome. He's incredible. But you'll see this quote, which seems very negative, and we'll kind of go through it together a little bit to kind of apply everything that I've been talking about the past couple weeks. He says, people's growing love of psychology is a terrible thing. Psychology helps those in the West, but it is a dreadful thing when the Orthodox learn psychology and substitute it for the neptic tradition of the church. The neptic tradition meaning like hesychasm, Jesus prayer, etc. He says, we must undermine Orthodox Christians' love of psychology because psychological methodology is outside the Orthodox tradition and at the same time it is characterized by the Western mentality. I am sorry about those spiritual fathers who assert that the spiritual life is not enough and psychology is also necessary. It's a little scandalous. I read that and like as a former therapist myself, I was like, well, that's not very fair. Like, what do I do with this quote? Let me just go on and like interact with that, and then if you still have a question at the end of it, I'll take it then. So what do we do with this? He's a saint of the church, right? Part of us wants to kind of be like, you know, either just accept it as gospel or to throw it off entirely. He didn't know what he was talking about or something like that. So I guess first principle, it's true. Saints are not by themselves infallible. That's true. We know that. But I also don't think we need to say that he's wrong on this. Actually, I think he's right. You just need to understand him properly. So what is he actually saying? He says a lot of scary words, like love of psychology is a terrible thing, and that can be kind of scandalous. But what is he actually saying? If you kind of look through that quote, what he's really criticizing is when people use psychology to substitute for Orthodox spiritual life, or when they say that Orthodox life is not enough for our salvation. That's the thing he's really getting at, and he's completely right about that. Not only is he right about to criticize that, but people do this all the time. This is a very present temptation. I've seen various, even Orthodox authors kind of talk like this, functionally speaking, where they'll sort of use psychology to form sort of the meat of their worldview, and then just paste orthodoxy on top of that as insofar as it fits within that psychological mindset, right? So they kind of think in terms of life in terms of psychology while keeping orthodoxy sort of on a leash, and you can use it when it's necessary. And that doesn't make sense if orthodoxy is our principle for how we view the world, right? So another point, Saint Sophrony is somebody who is not living the same kind of life that we're living. Saint Sophrony was a wonderful ascetic of the church who was thrown deeply, deeply, deeply into this spiritual life where every hour of his life was a extreme struggle against himself, against his inner world. He was praying constantly, extremely deep, extremely arduous spiritual life. This is not the same kind of life that we're living. He doesn't have the same kind of temptations of the world that we have, the same needs of interacting with people. He can spend all day, in his cell saying the Jesus prayer, right? And kind of examining his heart and working through any issues that might be in there. We have to kind of see that his life isn't exactly like our life, so his way of talking about it might not be our way of talking about it. Unless we're going to say that we have the same kind of strength that Saint Sophrony has, or we have that sort of spiritual life. Another point, we would, like I was hinting at earlier, affirm with that saint that there are pitfalls that the use of psychology can lead to in Orthodox spiritual life, and that's one of the last things I'll talk about today, but I'll kind of go through what I see is the major ways that psychology can cause us problems in our spiritual life. So we would agree that it can be problematic. One of the things I wonder, just as I read this quote and think about it, is it sounds like he's talking about the abuse of psychology. It sounds like he's talking about an unmeasured use of it and using it to throw away the Orthodox tradition. And I wonder if he would have said it about a tool that was being used properly. Like, he's criticizing how it comes from the West, but there are so many things, so many bits of technology that come from the West that everyone would have no problem implementing because they're just a tool that people use in their life. So I don't think that Saint Sophrony would say that somebody who is undergoing like severe mental health issues should never use psychology. And in fact, in other quotes, if you look at what he says elsewhere, he does affirm that psychology is very good for especially that kind of situation. So I think in general, while it's like a scandalous quote on the surface, and it seems like he's saying the Orthodox are against psychology, we should not interpret saints the way that fundamentalists interpret the Bible. Like, we don't look at it and like, well, what does it actually say? You know, it says, "Call no man father." Therefore, I'm never going to use the word father again to talk to my own dad, or whatever, or to talk to a priest. Like, we shouldn't just look at quotes of the saints and say, like, "Oh, what he said is what it means. Psychology is a terrible thing." So there you go. We have to kind of like look a little bit deeper. Look at it in context. And I think when we look at this quote, which is one of the most anti-psychology ones that I found, when we look at it in context, he's actually not saying anything that's that against anything that I've said in this class. He's sort of affirming everything that I've said, I think. That it needs to be in its proper place, and it can't be used to undermine the Orthodox tradition. Let's see. So just looking at, I wanted to sketch out really quickly a picture of a person who has good mental health, because I think that the Orthodox would see virtue in this person just as much as people in the psychological profession would see virtue. So what does good mental health look like? I got to be very general, but I would say they're reasonably secure in their self. Right? They're not insecure. They're not always wondering, like, is he angry at me? And like paralyzed fear, not always getting offended at every little thing because they have a little bit of self-esteem, a little bit of self-respect. They're not always defending themselves against inner self-loathing. They can handle criticism. If something bad happens to them, they can bounce back because they don't have sort of just this fundamental self-hatred that people have. So just reasonable security in their self. Person with good mental health isn't resentful of others, and so when they talk to other people, they're not passive-aggressive. They're not beating on other people to make themselves feel better. A person with really good mental health would have a stable mood. They're not falling into the depths of depression all the time and having that ruin their life, or getting way too high and making ridiculous decisions. They're stable. They have a healthy balance of self-care and boundaries and service to others. They're not thinking, well, like if I was a good person, then I would be doing more for others, and so having insecurity because of feeling like they're too selfish, even though they're not being selfish. Right? It's this balance of self-care and taking care of others. They would be capable of interacting and working with or relating to others in effective ways. So they might be able to just sort of intuitively understand, have a normal sense of why others might think and feel the way they do and react accordingly, rather than being like, well, why is she upset? All I did was, like ignore her one time or whatever. Just a normal sense of understanding human behavior. So essentially this is a person who's not sabotaged by their mental health. They're not kind of like held back by some sort of thing that's gone wrong in their psyche. And so while these things, like we said, they don't make somebody holy, they don't grant you your salvation to have this sort of basic mental health, but we can all say that it is useful. And if something is useful, isn't it good? Because you can implement those things. So I would say this all leads to the principle is that everything that helps us is okay, unless there's some clear reason why it's not okay. And it's the same thing with psychology. Psychology is okay unless it's not. It's okay unless it hurts. And then I'll go over the pitfalls later on and talk about that. Did you still have the question from before, or did I answer it? Well, let's save it to the end, if it works. Yeah, just don't forget it. Yep. Let me just take a second to make sure I'm pacing things so that I don't have to rush through things at the very end. More time has gone by than I planned on. Okay, so very practical matters. What kind of therapist? How to find a therapist? What should we be looking for in a therapist if we're somebody who's looking for mental health? A couple things. I would say for certain, have them be trained and licensed. This provides for some basic decency, right? Some people can kind of call themselves like healers or even like life coaches. I don't know so much about that business. It's distinct though. If you're looking into psychology, a good way to just assure a little bit of quality control is if they're trained and licensed. More school is not necessarily better. Most therapists, pretty much all therapists, are master's entry, but it's not that someone with a doctorate is better than someone with a master's degree. It's really about the person and how you work with that person. More important than their academic knowledge is that you click as a team, that you have respect for them, that they have respect for you. So a really, really good therapist who just has a master's degree in counseling is going to be much, much better than somebody who's annoying and has a PhD. Like if anyone's seen What About Bob, which is one of my favorite movies, he's not a good therapist at all. He's the worst. Well, anyway, I would say as we're committed to the Orthodox kind of view of life, the therapist should certainly not be somebody who's strongly committed to something that completely conflicts with it. It doesn't mean they need to agree with everything that we would think or assert, but you just don't want it to be a problem. So if they kind of make some part that strongly disagrees with Orthodox Christianity a major part of their presentation or what they do, that will become an issue, at least in part because of what I said. You need to click as a team. You need to be able to work together. But you will find, if you're too picky, that the majority of psychologists in the field, like I said, it's largely a secular field. You can find Christian psychologists. You can find psychologists that are secular but would largely support your moral system. But you'll find a whole lot of psychologists who are very, very affirming of all the different LGBTQ stuff. And if they are kind of making that a major part of their presentation and they're all about that, that will probably become something, if you're committed to sort of the Orthodox view of those issues, that will become something that comes in between you, I would say. So I would caution against somebody who's strongly committed to that. A reality kind of needs to be acknowledged that a secular therapist will probably not, and you can't blame them, but they probably won't have much understanding of humility or a commitment to morals. And they might even see the idea of you pursuing humility as kind of an issue. They might say, like, why do you want to lower your opinion of yourself? This is an issue. What did your father do to you that made you want to think less of yourself? Because they just don't get it. Like, you can't blame them. It's just like, to them, it's like, well, I want you to love yourself and think highly of yourself. There's nothing in their worldview that would allow them to understand self-sacrifice or humility or things like this. And same thing with like sexual ethics, which especially sexual ethics which don't involve other people. One thing to keep in mind is that you might feel you're kind of like strong in your faith and set in your ideals, but when you're doing therapy with someone, you're talking about the deepest parts of yourself. You're in an extremely vulnerable position, and so you're going to be opening yourself up to this person and be in this very almost like childlike state in a sense, depending on what kind of therapy you're doing. So you may be more open to influence from this person than you think. So just keep that in mind going into it. So should we seek after a Christian therapist? This was brought up a little bit last week. There are some pros and cons to this. The pros: Christian therapists won't pathologize your belief. They won't say, like, oh, you're looking for like a replacement for your father, and you're looking for some way to hate yourself because of some deep psychological self-loathing or whatever, and that's what your belief in God is. A Christian therapist obviously won't have that. They'll understand belief in God and what we're kind of going for in our lives. They are more likely to understand, but not guaranteed, like a sense of Christian moral life, and just kind of like the Christian struggle toward that things. And they might even be able to connect mental health and the science of mental health to its proper place, which is most beautifully found in connection with spiritual life. But there are some cons with this too to be aware of. So I've often found with Christian therapists that there ends up being this weird mixture of psychology and Jesus that you don't really know where one stops and where the other one starts. And often, like I've been saying before, they will like de facto prioritize the mental health psychology view over the Christian view. And the Christian view is just sort of like a belief you have that's sort of pasted on top of your actual worldview, which is the psychological worldview. They might have strange beliefs that are different from yours. I actually once had I had a Protestant therapist, and he was good and everything. He wasn't like over the line or anything, but he just was an evangelical, and he kind of talked like an evangelical, and he assumed that like I was kind of like that too. And it was just like a little weird. I mean, like I handled that by just being like, yeah, okay, I just tried to ignore it. But they may think that they understand you and your spirituality. Most even secular psychologists will have had Christian patients, and they'll know just enough about Christianity to be dangerous, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I understand how you feel about Jesus, and it's like, no you don't, just stop. Another thing I would say is that sometimes they're less good. Not that being a Christian makes you a bad therapist, but being in a niche allows you to be in a smaller pond, I suppose, and still have people be loyal to you. So again, it's not that a Christian therapist will be like less good at being a therapist, but it can happen that it's what you get with that is sort of mediocre quality therapy with like Bible verses pasted on top. So I would say a principle there is like you're going to science, right? You're going to receive a service, so get the best. I think most people here would rather hire an expert, experienced atheist surgeon rather than like an Orthodox Christian who's like, like half senile or whatever, or like is mediocre or like doesn't know what's going on, right? Like you're not going to therapy for a spiritual experience, right? So you don't need to get a spiritual experience out of therapy. You can just go to therapy for the mental health. This is one of the beautiful things of keeping a separation between the two, is that you don't need to force the spiritual into that scientific process that you're going through in that more kind of, secular worldview. You can just go to the secular to get your secular goods and then come back out. I think, talking about ideals, really the perfect situation would be is if you could find an Orthodox therapist who is very committed to their orthodoxy and has a good balance between their orthodoxy and their psychology. But like, good luck finding that. There's not that many Orthodox Christians. There's not that many Orthodox Christian therapists. And among those, how many of them are going to connect with you, right? And there's another hidden pitfall to that if you are going to an Orthodox therapist, any way they don't connect with you, or that their faith doesn't jive with yours, or their understanding of you isn't accurate, is going to just hurt all the more, because there's this sort of presumption of unity. And so if that's not there, it'll just be all the more heartbreaking and get in the way. So my general opinion, and this is just my opinion, but I would say a secular therapist is just fine, as long as they respect your orthodoxy, and they should. That's what they teach them to do. But there are dangers to that, like I said. Realistically speaking, like I said, a secular therapist, but a good one, who is good at their job, who doesn't make spirituality some kind of problem for you. Like I said before, there's this sort of principle that plain secular things are sort of less threatening to our spiritual life than some sort of weird blend between secular and spiritual, or trying to kind of mash them together. Because we live in this secular world, and we all know how to deal with atheism and with secularism. Our guard is up against it, and so in a way we're much more safe. But if they're trying to sneak in spiritual kind of issues into the therapy, then it can get very confusing, and it can actually cause more problems. That's just my opinion, but my 2 cents on that. All right, a little bit more what kind of therapist. In terms of what gender, either gender could work. If you're a man, you don't have to go to a man. You could go to a woman. But again, the relationship is going to be what's really important. You want to be with somebody who you can relate to and talk to and be comfortable with. A lot of women are more comfortable with a woman, and that's perfectly fine. I had a girlfriend who had some problems, but she didn't really like women. She wouldn't have been able to respect a woman. And you say what you want about her mental health, she was a little crazy maybe, but that was true for her. It would have been a problem in her therapy, so she found a male therapist. Nothing wrong with that. One thing about the gender, though, is that the person who's your therapist is going to have a role in the therapy that you can't extract. So you can't undo the fact that it's a woman that you're talking to, or a man that you're talking to. So, for example, if your father was a problem in your life in some way, he was rough on you and you have some issues because of that, or he abandoned the family, whatever else. If that happened, you're going to be talking about that with your therapist and working through that. And chances are good that if your therapist is a man, you'll see your father in the therapist. That's called transference, where you take some experience you had with somebody else and sort of put it on somebody else. So that's not a bad thing. That can actually be really good. One of the activities you can do in therapy is actually kind of like role playing. The therapist can actually be your father and give you a chance to say you shouldn't have treated me like that, and that can be a really healing thing. That can be an asset. It can also be something that would hold you back. I mean, if you're somebody who was mistreated by men, then it could be really, really hard for you to open up to a man. If you're somebody who doesn't like women, like my ex-girlfriend, then it could be really hard for you to work with a woman. So that's just keep in mind that it will affect it, but you can go to whatever you prefer, and it'll work. But just it's sort of like whatever you want on that. Not that it doesn't matter, but make your choice, whatever you're comfortable with. In terms of the person's therapeutic approach, I mentioned very, very briefly, I'm sad that we don't have enough time to go into like actual therapeutic interventions and like exactly what happens in like a CBT session or DBT or more psychodynamic. I'd like to do that. There's just not enough time. But there are pluses and minuses to different things, but like largely speaking, the average therapist you'll go to will be a blend of all those different things and use whatever approach they know of to be more effective for you in your moment with whatever issue you're going through. Let's see. So yeah, I mean, there's a variety in approaches for therapists. Some are sort of like that classic, like super affirming, like it's not your fault, it's okay kind of thing, and that can be helpful for some people. And some are more pressing. Some are more kind of like severe, right? And it's like whatever might work for you, right? That's the whole principle, is like you want to be with somebody who can actually help you, and you can have an initial consultation with this person, right? You don't need to know right from the beginning. You don't need to commit. It's not like when you make a therapy session that like you're getting engaged to them or something like that. Talk to them, see if it's something that can work for you, and if you get the going to work for you, then go try someone else. I mean, therapists are very, very used to, and they'll be happy to hear, I don't think I'll be able to work very well with you. I'm going to find someone else. Any therapist you say that to would probably be like, great, okay, I'm glad that you have like the mental health to be able to like confront me like that. So I guess I would encourage then being forthright with any therapist that you start with. There's nothing wrong with going into therapy and saying, I'm a very committed Orthodox Christian, or like, I'm not so committed of an Orthodox Christian, but I kind of like it. The principle is like, be honest with them, be completely upfront. That's the most important thing. I guess a good therapist will be able to take anything you give them and use it to help you. Just like, in Orthodoxy we teach that everything that we go through in our life, it's God trying to help us for our salvation, right? It's always an opportunity. Anytime you say anything or have any interaction with a therapist, they should be able to see something in that and use it and interpret it so that they can treat you better. So if you go into the office and they say, how are you doing today? And you start screaming at them and throw the pillow in their face, the therapist will be like, good, like we have something here. Like they won't be like, that hurt my feelings, right? Like they'll be able to say like, seems like you're feeling mad at me today. What were you feeling as you threw that pillow in my face? Random question, does anyone have a cough drop or something like that?
Yes.
Oh, she beat you. Oh, he beat you. I love this service. Thank you. Right. In terms of like basics, your kind of standard therapy session would be 50 minutes. It's called a clinical hour because the hour includes like their documentation time and their processing time afterward. So you'd actually typically spend 50 minutes with them. Normal would be like once a week or once every 2 weeks, but that varies depending on your needs. That same Christian therapist that I talked about, that I used to go to, I went to him when I was working in the prison for the kind of like criminally insane, and that was a very intense job, and I saw a lot of horrible things and a lot of horrible people on a day-to-day basis. And my point in going to therapy to him was not to talk about my relationship with my father. My point in going to therapy to him was just to have somebody that I could vent to and talk about all the things I'd seen with, so that I didn't bring that home to Marushka Anna there. Like I knew that she couldn't take like me saying, well, like, this guy like killed himself today, or like this guy was doing XYZ and whatever. Like she didn't need that. She didn't need to hear about all the horrible things, and there were horrible things. And so I used that therapist to just download all that junk onto, kind of like how we use Father Theophan too. Insurance-wise, some will take insurance, and so it can be reasonably affordable. But others, and the sad reality is sometimes they're the best because they don't need to take insurance, because people will pay $300 $300 an hour with them or more. Sometimes they don't take insurance, so it's give or take, but I have seen fantastic therapists that take insurance. I've seen fantastic therapists that charge far, far less than they should because they might be secular, but they still are in this profession because they love people and they want to help. So they're not monsters or just businessmen. You'll find variety, but let's see. Okay, in terms of when to graduate from therapy or to be done with it, I think we covered therapy isn't immoral in any sense. It's not like it's bad or fallen or less than. So there's not really a need to watch that closely and say, like, I want to get out of therapy as quickly as I can because it's wrong or something. We don't need to say that. I think the idea is just to use it until it's not worth your time or your money anymore. Like I said earlier, therapy is the most useful, I would say, especially to our spiritual life, when we have serious things that are debilitating us and keeping us from just like our daily lives and functioning. And after that, you could say the returns are smaller, like diminishing returns, but that's not to say that it's not worth it and that you can't get better. I saw that therapist in Michigan the whole time, and the goal was just maintenance, right? There was no urge to like get out of that relationship or anything like that. The only Orthodox caveat, and it's not much of one, to this would be, actually St. Sophrony talks about this as well, and he and other saints caution us from spying on ourselves, is the way they usually say it. And what they mean by that is like excessively like looking at ourselves, excessively like looking inside. And they would say not just with psychology, but even with spiritual things. Like they see a danger in like constantly pondering, like, why did I do that? What was I thinking that way? Constantly psychoanalyzing yourself, spending all this time like questioning what's going on in there. The saints recommend moderation in that, because that can be destructive. It can be obsessive. You can end up kind of being like a professional patient. Possible pitfalls from therapy. I've gone through some of these as we go, but just to put them all in one place here. So again, I'm not arguing against therapy in any way. I think it can be useful, but we do have to acknowledge possible issues or temptations. It can cause problems. We have to admit that. One of them would be absorbing this sort of like secular mindset from a therapist or a not Orthodox Christian mindset from the therapist. Like I said, you're in this very vulnerable state. A therapist can be very influential on you. And I'm not saying they're evil and that they're going to try to use that against you, but it's just a reality that when you're working very closely with somebody like that and talking about very deep things, you can and probably will be affected by it in some way. The therapist could, even if they're trying not to do this or they have the best intentions, take Orthodox virtues such as humility and kind of make them a problem in your life. Like asceticism, that sounds unhealthy, like why are you trying to, what do you mean you're trying to go through suffering? What do you mean you're fasting so that you're deprived so that you can pray? Like they might not understand that. And I would say this can be annoying at best and really destructive at worst. So it really kind of depends, like how set are you in your faith? If you're very secure in your orthodoxy and you're not subject to kind of being tossed to and fro, it'll be okay, and you can just be like, stop it, And like they should respect it. Like it would be immoral for a therapist to like insist on things. Like if they are pushing on like the humility thing, for instance, I think I would just say to them, like, I think you don't understand this, and I'm going to ask you to go ahead and leave that on the table. Like, this is not what I want to talk about with you, right? You're hiring them, you use them the way you want to use them. You can be forthright with them. Like I've said a bunch of times now, there's always this temptation of prioritizing mental health and like putting the cart before the horse in terms of orthodoxy and sort of your mental health. We can really, really easily shift to viewing everything in our life through the mental health lens rather than the Orthodox lens. With that also, we can heal sort of our mind, heal our thoughts, but then leave like our deep heart kind of untouched, unhealed. And the problem with this is not that psychology should be trying to heal your heart, but it can just be confusing, and it can be tempting because orthodoxy is hard. It doesn't have easy answers, and often it doesn't reward you in the moment, right? You might have to struggle with like your spiritual practices for years and years and years, and it's just not quite as rewarding in the same way in the moment where like you have a breakthrough in a therapy session or whatever. So you can kind of easily start to get into this mental state where it's like, well, therapy is where I actually get better. In orthodoxy, I like pray and I pray, but nothing seems to happen or whatever. I think it's possible for a psychologist or psychiatrist to act like a spiritual father in a way and start discussing spiritual issues as if that's in their purview. Maybe not like, I don't think they would give you a prayer rule or whatever, but like questioning your spiritual practices, etc. And like I said already with that, the best thing to do is just draw a boundary for the therapist. Be like, I don't think you understand my spiritual life, and I'd just like you to leave that to the side. Let's see. I've seen this, it sounds weird, but it can happen where if you're going through therapy a lot, it can be easy to expect other people to treat you like how a therapist does. So like therapists are experts in how to talk to people and how to ask questions without being offensive. They're experts in just how to relate to people and how to communicate. And it's really easy to take that and then look at other people who are not experts in that and then kind of criticize and judge them for it. Not everybody is gifted in like how to communicate in a psychologically healthy way. And one way that this could cause a problem is that you could sort of expect perhaps like your spiritual father to talk to you in that same way. If your spiritual father is like pushing you to something, saying like, pushing you on some sin or something like that, it can be easy to think like, well, my spiritual father isn't respecting my boundaries, like in the same way that your psychologist would or whatever. But like, it's not that, and I mean, that your spiritual father should be respecting your boundaries, but you have to get an accurate sense of if he actually is, right? There's a real place in life, like we said last time, for like call to action. Like that idea of like, just shut up and do it, and like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that can be toxic, and it can be used to like kind of abuse people. I don't know, I always equate that kind of mentality with like my grandpa's generation a little bit, where it's just like, just get over it, what did my grandpa always say? Like mind over matter, put up or shut up. These things can like really cause problems, but also like there's a reason that people talk like that is because there's actually also a role for that. There's a role for like saying, I don't care why you can't do it, just force yourself to do it. If that's being implemented well, then that's good. We can't just brush that off because it's hard. And there's also a place for the kind of more gentle approach that therapists take. So, in addition, some spiritually problematic things. I'm not going to go into it hardcore, but for example, like some therapists would really recommend like yoga or certain kinds of meditation. And I'm not going to fully go into yoga and say like good or bad or whatever, but I think at the very least you could say possibly problematic. And so there are things like that. So the last thing I have here with the possible pitfalls is because I mentioned before that for a secular psychologist, and I think most psychologists, even if they are Christians, will kind of assume that all of your thoughts and everything you are comes from your brain, and so everything that's in you is from the real you. And so as a consequence of that, they can identify your Well, let me go back a little bit just to kind of refresh that, like, the Orthodox do not teach that, right? We can have thoughts that are whispered to us from demons, or just kind of like from our sort of fallen self that don't actually originate from our heart. They don't come from us. They're just sort of like our fallen sort of ego. That's not truly who we are. But because of the psychologists don't necessarily have that distinction, and they assume materialism, often you'll find that they can identify your fallen self with who you really are and say, like, well, that thought you had about killing your mother comes from somewhere inside of you. That is you, right? And one way you see this kind of outworked is, and this is more from a Freudian sense, but Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, saw a lot of problems in people repressing emotions, right? And one of the ways that he sought to treat people that had repressed emotions was encouraging them to act out on their impulses. And if anyone's ever seen the movie A Dangerous Method, I don't know if you have, it's about Freud and Jung. It's a kind of a fun movie. But he encourages Jung, who is having, who's another psychologist, and who's having, he's married, but he encourages him to start an affair with a patient that he's treating right now because he feels that he wants that deeply inside of himself, and Freud kind of counsels him and says, like, this is deep inside of you. You need to kind of access that. You should act out on it. That's just an outworking of identifying our thoughts, our impulses with who we truly are. I realize that we're kind of over time. I didn't get into the hot button issues and whatever. One thing we could do is we could just wrap it up, or I could go on, and anyone who has time or wants to stay could stay. I don't know, Father, do you have a preference?
You could also, if people want to ask questions at this point, and then go on from that. Whatever you want to do, Father, is okay with me.
Okay. Yeah, are there questions right now? Or things to go through? Yes, John? Oh, yeah.
Okay. So the first question is, I guess the word necessary and unnecessary were used a lot. And that's a little weird to me because there's a lot of things in just human life, in our human life generally, that could be considered unnecessary. We could just do that. And what we also think about this is specific part about considering psychology necessary, which was, I guess, a commentary of Western society. But it doesn't make me wonder if you start judging things by their necessity, where does that take you? Because if you, kind of the point was that I was getting from that was that orthodoxy is a necessity and everything else is unnecessary. But if you judge even orthodoxy itself by necessity, and unnecessity doesn't seem like a word, but whatever that word would be, how do you draw that line without shedding too much of what makes life, or what makes anything, because there's things that aren't necessary everywhere that are necessary. And is that wrong?
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to be careful about drawing some kind of strict line, and I hinted at this in the very first class a couple weeks ago about the idea of what is in the church, or what belongs to the church, what Orthodox spiritual life includes. It's not like there's some strict line somewhere where it's here it is, and then outside of this is outside of Orthodox spiritual life. Orthodoxy tends to be holistic in everything it does. tends to, so like in a sense, like I was saying in the first class, like the whole world belongs to God from an Orthodox point of view, and all of our scientific achievements and everything belong to God. So yeah, I agree. You can get into trouble if you're trying to draw strict lines about what's necessary and what's not necessary, and that can lead to kind of like a neurotic, weird way of viewing life that I don't think fits into the Orthodox point of view. I think I'm hazarding that danger in this point because I'm trying to make a very specific point about like what we need to affirm, I guess, as Orthodox Christians. So one of the things, I think one of the principles that you have to kind of hang your hat on if you're Orthodox is that the Church is Catholic, meaning that it doesn't lack things that we need. It doesn't like require something from the outside. Like it's not like there's some other teaching that like Orthodoxy doesn't have and you can't be saved without that thing. But obviously like you have to be careful like what you're applying that to. Like we all need food, and like Orthodoxy doesn't like teach food, or like it's not like the priest throws food out of the altar or something like that. So it's not like, it's more in terms of like I think the emphasis is that the Church has everything we need for our salvation, and that's just basically a guardian against like saying that we have to go to other or different teachings to augment Orthodoxy, because Orthodoxy isn't enough. It's not so much saying like that you can't use farming techniques or air conditioning, or that like you don't need medical care or whatever. That would be kind of like a stifled way of viewing it. So yeah, I think I see where you're coming from, and I agree that would be a weird way of approaching it. I was kind of using more of those categories for like the sake of argument, I guess, in this specific case to make a specific point, sort of. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. One thing I could do is that just if people, I can kind of try to sort of quickly go through the rest that I have, and if people need to go or whatever, you could go. Fair? Okay. All right. Sorry, I took too much time going through my things, but working on it. Okay. I wanted to talk about the hot button issues, the hot takes. The first thing I had was this concept of self-esteem, and then comparing that with the Orthodox idea of humility or shame or self-love. Right? People make caricatures of the world of psychology, saying that it's all about self-esteem. They're just trying to affirm you're okay, it's not your fault, that sort of thing. It's not completely undeserved. Some therapists lean really heavily into that. I don't think that's good therapy, but you can kind of see where that caricature comes from a little bit, even though it is a caricature. Psychology sees virtue in self-esteem, that is like loving yourself, because it has a good connection with happiness. If you love yourself, love your life, you'll tend to be happy. And that's, if you could sum up, the goals of psychology in one word, I guess it would be happiness. Although that's not completely fair to the breadth of the tradition, but psychologists would also say that self-esteem can become a problem. It can be disordered when it works against utility, and this would be like narcissism, like having such a high opinion of yourself that it's all of a sudden become an issue for you. So that's psychology. The Orthodox see self-love, though, as they call it the mother of the passions. Christ says things like, hate your own selves. Right? Again, like scandalous. Like, what are they talking about? I have to hate myself? And if you read a lot of the prayers of the church, they're just very penitential, talking about how I'm the worst sinner, I'm the chief of all sinners. So what does this mean? How can these two sort of be reconciled? How can we be the worst of all sinners, but then also not fall into despair, hate ourselves, all that kind of thing? Because the fathers, when they talk about the idea of us hating ourselves or being in despair or despondent, they see that as pride, essentially. They don't see that as a good thing. So there's this distinction between hating ourselves in like that kind of bad despair sense, and what the fathers are recommending in terms of humility. So what's going on there? And the answer is has to do with who we are. What we say our real self is, I guess another way of saying this, what we are is us in our connection with God. And so pride, therefore, then be like a love of self in isolation from God. Like we're made to be with God, we're made to be like God. So therefore, to be ourselves, we must be connected with God. We can't really think of ourselves in terms of not connected with God. And if we do, that is the thing that the fathers are cautioning us against. That's the thing that the fathers are saying, like, you should hate your own selves. Because that's not the real self. That's a fake self. It's like a little parasite, a little idol on you that doesn't actually exist. There's a quote that I read on this that's a little confusing, but I'll try to read it slowly. He says, "Because man has his true reality only in God, by loving himself apart from God, man cannot truly love himself, for he is loving something other than self in himself, an ego that is not self. And thus, in a certain manner, he indirectly hates what he truly is." St. Anthony the Great from the 4th century says, "He who loves God loves himself." Right? It's this connection between God, seeing our true selves as us with God. Like that is what we are. St. Maximus the Confessor says that one with bad self-love, that's like this pride, he calls him a lover of himself against himself. He thinks he loves himself, but he's loving like his fake self, somebody who he isn't actually. So when we talk about hating ourselves, we're talking about like what Scripture calls the old man, this egocentric part of ourselves that desires separation from God, and we would embody this sort of fallen fake self, and we kind of make it us in a way if we live a life of sin and live a life of increasing distance from God. So then humility is ourself as we actually are. We can compare that with shame, which isn't really looking at yourself as you actually are, but is more of like a neurotic attack on yourself. It's saying like, you are bad because of X. And it's complicated, but in essence, if you want to boil it down into one sentence, the fathers see shame and that sort of bad hating of yourself as coming from an over-concern for like the status of yourself. They're saying you hate yourself because you wanted yourself in isolation of God to be something that you're not. You have this high opinion of yourself that wasn't reflected in the eyes of other people, and so you respond to that by with shame, with despair, with disliking yourself. So the whole key, I would say, to the Orthodox idea of humility, and so that we can hear what the prayers are saying and not just take it as like toxic, self-hating stuff that the church is giving us, is it's all about what do we mean by I, like who am I? Because the true meaning deep down always has to be us in Christ, not in isolation from Christ. So we can, and actually some of the fathers say we must love ourselves as long as we understand who we actually are. By ourselves, you're meaning like you with Jesus, the Jesus you. St. Maximus calls that beautiful self-love. By extension, that's how we can be unconditionally loving to others as well, is because behind every annoying person, behind every sinner, everything, there's like this beautiful creation in Christ. This is a person who's supposed to be with Christ and living in connection with Christ. So that's the other that we love as well, is that other who's in connection with Christ. Quickly, demons and insanity. Demons are fallen spiritual powers, and if you read the Fathers, they'll say that they can suggest thoughts to us. They can sort of like whisper things to us, put temptations in our ears, and they characterize them as like perfectly evil, sort of like the devil, wanting our destruction. However, they don't know our insides, they can't control us, they can only guess at them, and guess at what would be tempting, what would be destructive for us. They can't force their way into us, we have to give them power in some way. It doesn't necessarily have to be explicit, but you could think of demons affecting us in terms of like a robber knocking at the door of our house. He's like, let me in, and you can just say no. That's what watchfulness is all about in the Orthodox tradition, is kind of like keeping those bad thoughts out of your heart. So if we do, however, let that robber into our house and give them power, they can exert great influence on us. They can cause all manner of destruction, including things which manifest as mental health issues. They can kind of tear you apart inside a little bit. So while it would be wrong to say that all mental health issues are from demons, we also have to say that like our intellect and emotions are part of us, and that is part of what demons and spiritual forces can try to pervert in us and cause us to think and act in a way that's destructive. And that is what mental health issues are, is thinking and acting in ways that are destructive and not in accord with health. This is my opinion, but so I saw guys in the prison who, seemed like demonically influenced. It's hard to say, I'm not qualified to say, but completely seemed to have, not be acting like humans anymore, I guess. But some of those guys were very, very heavily medicated as a result of that. So it's just my opinion, but I would say, because people might say, how can medication fix demons? If that's actually the problem, then why does medication fix it? My sense is that heavy medicine can sort of nullify any demonic effects that are there by sort of knocking somebody out, loading them up with Haldol. That was the usual. And because it knocks everything in them out, of course, it knocks out all of their behaviors, so they're just kind of shuffling around like a zombie. But that would leave you functionally unhealed still. It's not like it fixes you and heals you to a place of health. How to tell if a mental health issue is demonic or if it's just mental health, right? Because not every mental health issue has its origin in demons, like I said. So basic questions and principles. There's no way to recognize it in some sort of clear way, but what you could ask yourself is what has the person done, or what have they been exposed to? Have they done something that lets demons into their heart? Are they doing seances and playing with Ouija boards and everything else like that? Or are they Satanists, right? Is there some reason to believe that they have invited evil things into their heart? Do they respond to baptism or exorcism? I heard a story actually in Texas of there was a Catholic guy that was converting to Orthodoxy, and I think he had a whole bunch of kids too, 8 or 10 kids or something, and he was seeing demons for a period of time. And after his baptism, he stopped seeing demons. I don't know, but that's what he said, and so we can have respect for that reality while not necessarily saying exactly what happened there. It's kind of a mystery. So do they respond to baptism or exorcism? And then what is the character of their disorder? Right? Is it something that just seems to be they just have some sort of cognitive distortions, would be the psychological way of talking about it, or some sort of bad ways of thinking that lead to mental health issues? Or does it seem does it have that kind of inhuman sort of feel to it? These don't tell you the answer for sure, but they could kind of point to it, to a certain conclusion, I guess. Practically speaking, obviously we're not supposed to be worried about demons and living in anxiety, oh no, the demons. The best defense against demons from an Orthodox perspective is just to live in a regular Orthodox life. Receive communion, go to confession, pray, try to keep your connection with God alive. You don't need to do anything special. You don't necessarily need to go to St. Anthony's Monastery in the desert and have a giant exorcism or whatever. Just live your Orthodox life. I think another practical note, we're kind of encouraged to see our issues and then take responsibility for those issues. So we acknowledge the presence of demons and that they can have an impact on our life, but we don't just blame everything on them. We don't say, well, the demons maybe do that. The demons maybe do that. The impulse should, I think, typically be to take that on ourselves and say, like, I still gave them assent. I still said yes to their ideas that they suggested to me. That's my fault. I'm going to go to confession now and deal with this. Okay. Quickly, does religion cause mental health issues? I'll try to be quick. So this is a charge made by some people in the psychological world. Freud, for instance, was very anti-religious and saw religion as like an oppressive force, broadly speaking. The quick answer I would give to this is that anything can be misused, and that religion is a fantastic club if you're going to misuse it, because it's so powerful in somebody's life. It builds up the basis of how they view reality. It says that there's this ultimate being, God, that's at the center of everything. And so, like, if somebody is trying to control or distort religion, and the same thing with like starting wars. Religion is just a fantastic excuse to start wars if you want. It's a very powerful club that can be used and abused if somebody wants to use and abuse it. So this is called religious abuse, though, and so like you shouldn't, I don't think, judge something just based on its abuse, unless you can draw a straight line from the abuse to like the core of what that thing is. Like you could say, for instance, I don't have time to like completely demonstrate this, but like Islam, for instance, is a religion that you can kind of, without pushing too far, see how it can lead to violence. There's pretty clear things in there that kind of like, it's like, well, it's not a stretch to see that a follower of Muhammad could interpret that as meaning I should be violent. And that's sort of the history of the religion as well. You can't really do the same thing with Christianity. Like Jesus just wasn't that guy. Like people have done it. People have justified atrocities in the name of Christianity, but it's pretty hard to like draw a clear line from like the Sermon on the Mount to like go kill them. You know, it just doesn't really fit, I think, if you're being intellectually honest. Same thing with this. It's just about not abusing it and having a good relationship with it. And one of the awesome things about Orthodoxy is that it provides us spiritual fathers, a spiritual tradition, and also just a right faith that isn't crazy, full of a bunch of stuff that can get people in trouble. Like, for example, I've known evangelicals to kind of have this temptation to be really neurotic and say like, oh, how am I doing? Everything's great. Everything's wonderful because I'm so blessed. Blessed, blessed, blessed. Everything is wonderful and God is taking good care of us. Meanwhile, they're just like denying all of their like inner agony and just trying to shove it aside because like I have to be happy because Jesus died for my sins, so things are good, right? This is how religion can like lead to neurotic behavior and issues and repression. I'll have to leave some of that on the table and not spend a whole bunch more time on it, but that's my little spiel on that. I was going to talk about non-professional mental health services, day-to-day things like 12-step programs, etc. I'm going to officially punt on that to Father Theophan. He said he'd be willing to go into those things in more detail if people are interested in that kind of thing. Self-help stuff, various support groups, personality tests, that kind of thing. Quickly, medications, which are a distinct field from psychology. You call it pharmacology or psychiatry. You go to a psychiatrist to get medications. From an Orthodox perspective, I think the church would say medications can clearly be a game changer. We know that the physical is bound up with the psychological, and medications are one of those things that can help people that are in that place that I was talking about at the beginning, where like they need it to function. Like they can't get through their life without that serotonin, without that dopamine. So like I think the idea then is thank God for that, because people that would normally be completely debilitated through medications can have a spiritual life and a normal life in general. That said, there are downsides, dangers, not to discount medications, but just to be aware simultaneously that there are possible issues. There are side effects that can cause issues. Even antidepressants can cause suicidality. They can cause weight gain and other issues. It can be very disconcerting to not know if what you're thinking and feeling is coming from the medication or from you. Hopefully that would be something that's figured out by getting on the right medication. But again, that can realistically be a bumpy path. But none of that is to say that you should disregard medications or view them as like not orthodox or in conflict with the spiritual life, because they can make all the difference in the world. So there's no principle against them. Actually, I have a word from Abbot Sergius at St. Tikhon's about this, and his idea is just, if it helps, take it. Very simple. Let's see. Orthodox psychology books and materials. My favorite ones that I've found, the first thing I would read if you're interested in more on this subject is, I think it's out of print, but you might be able to find it. It's called Ancient Christian Wisdom and Aaron Beck's Cognitive Therapy. That's by Bishop Alexis Trader, who's a bishop of the Diocese of Alaska. He's awesome. He was a monk on Mount Athos for a while. He's a very traditional Orthodox Christian, which is great because he doesn't ever sublimate the Orthodox tradition to the psychological world. He does a very, very good job of having respect for both traditions and putting them together. That's fantastic. Ancient Christian Wisdom and Aaron Beck's Cognitive Therapy. I like the Jean-Claude Larcher's books. They're a little bit more theological, but that would be like, he has a 4-volume set, or it might be 3-volume, I don't know, called Therapy for Spiritual Illnesses. That's describing how Orthodoxy seeks to heal, like in detail. Like, what are the spiritual practices and how do they heal the soul? How do they heal the mind? It's deep, but good stuff. He has another book called The Spiritual Unconscious that kind of deals with the intersection between Orthodox spiritual life and psychology. I think Herotheos Flakos, Bishop Herotheos, has a book called Orthodox Psychotherapy as well, that is that same sort of subject. These books are all a little bit more difficult. In general, I haven't been too impressed with like pop-level Orthodox psychology books. I haven't read all of them, so if you have one you like, tell me about it, and I'm not judging it because I probably haven't read it. But in general, I haven't been impressed by them. They almost always seem to fall into that trap that I've been talking about this whole time, where it's like, you just get the feeling they're writing a psychology book and then putting a little bit of sprinkling some Orthodox salt on top of it here and there. And they'll never tell you kind of the hard word. That's the thing, is if they're misrepresenting Orthodoxy, so to not let Orthodoxy like push on mental health like I think it needs to have a healthy balance. I just don't see the value in that. I think it can be very misleading. But again, I'm not trying to judge them. I haven't read them, all of them. I don't really know. I'm just saying, in general, I haven't found like an author where I was like, they like get it and they have respect, like true respect for both. They could be out there. Let's see. I think in general, a good principle is to be on guard against, have this sense that if somebody's telling you what you want to hear, especially with this confusing subject, to be suspicious. Like if something seems too neat and easy, if it all seems to have a nice little bow on it, and they don't have any of that like kind of Saint Sophrony stuff, they're not interacting with that in any way, shape, or form, I think suspicion is warranted. Not that it's useless or bad or wrong, but I think if we get that sense that they're telling us what we want to hear, maybe be a little bit cautious. I think the plain fact there is that Orthodox life is really, really hard, and we don't want to fall into that trap of using like psychology to either disguise that or explain it away. So my word on that, I guess, would be, it's fine. I would almost recommend, in general, if you're looking for psychological materials and books to read, again, you can just do well with secular psychological materials, because they might be better on the psychology aspect. And then the same principle, like you'll at least be on guard. Like if you're picking up a secular psychology book that's about cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive distortions, you will know this is not an Orthodox book. Whereas if you're reading an Orthodox psychology book, you'll be kind of like, I guess this is orthodoxy, and it's just a little bit more dangerous. So, kind of to summarize everything, I hope that I haven't come across as knocking psychology. I do think it needs to be checked in certain points by like a robust Orthodox tradition, but I love psychology. I majored in it, and I worked in the field of psychology as a therapist. I've used it myself. I've had friends and family members who have used psychology and found it completely life-changing. I recommend to a lot of people that they go to psychology, especially marriage therapy, by the way. I won't go into that, but like, it's psychology at its core is just a very studied, refined, scientifically tested way to interact with humans and interact with your thoughts. And so if the world has that to offer us, if we can be better at something, if we can improve in communication, learn to understand each other more, we can very much benefit from therapy. We can be better people, better Christians. We have to acknowledge that they have a different history, different assumptions, and different goals. But as long as we keep that in mind, and we can use it no problem. I said spiritual health is inherently like deeper and different than sort of the mental health aspect. But mental health can contribute to that. Our mental health, our rationality is part of who we are, and we don't want to dismiss that. So we have to dismiss this idea that using mental health is immoral or less than, or that we should feel shamed for using mental health services, or that we should shame others for using mental health services. This whole idea of if you were just a better Christian, then it would be fine, or you're being a bad Christian by using mental health, I think has no place in Orthodoxy. All that said, there are pitfalls to it, but my favorite phrase on that, discerning openness. Keep openness to it. There's no reason to shut it out, but we should always have like a tiny little bit of a guard up, just to kind of guard our hearts. Favorite way to think about it is it's a tool, just like any other technology, anything else in the world. It's a tool in our hand, it does a job. A car is good. A car can allow you to come to church. A car can allow you to serve others, to visit people. However, don't idolize your car and spend all your time thinking about it. And also don't run people over with your car. Don't do something evil with it, right? The concept of Egyptian gold. The Jews brought gold from Egypt out into the desert, and they can make a golden calf out of it, like an idol, or they can use it to build the Ark of the Covenant, right? And it's the same thing with psychology. We can say that psychology is a legitimate field and not like a bunch of nonsense or garbage. It's mental health is health. While we can say that, we also can say it's not true. It's not the truest, deepest sense of health, but we can view it as an image or a shadow or an assistant to our true health, which is the salvation of our whole person and the kind of reacquiring of what mankind had in the garden, what man was originally intended to be. Final kind of summarizing thought is that I think the best way to use mental health as Orthodox Christians would be to view it as a helper to help us to increase in our ability to become co-workers and co-participants with Christ in the restoration of all creation, starting with ourselves. And that is the end of my presentation. So, sorry it went long. Thank you. And I have a little time if anyone wants to like talk afterward or has questions or whatever, but let's pray. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption thou gavest birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. Thank you, everyone.